Before I ask my question, I'd like permission to introduce in the hearing record a letter from the Iowa Association of School Boards disagreeing with the National School Boards Association request for intervention from federal agencies and law enforcement and other concerns that they have.
Without objection.
Yeah. General Garland, regarding your October 4th school board memo, last week you said the memo was for law enforcement audience, despite it being on your public website as a press release. As a result of your memo, local school officials and parents may not speak up in these meetings out of fear that the federal government will do something to them. So that's a poisonous, chilling effect. Apparently that letter wasn't actually supported by organization, but was sent by 2 unauthorized staff. So last week the organization disavowed it, since you and the White House based your memo on this delegitimized letter. I assume you're going to revoke your extremely divisive memo that you said was instigated because of that letter. That's a question.
Senator, the memo, which is referred to as one page, it responds to concerns about violence, threats of violence, other criminal conduct. That's all it's about. And all it asks is for federal law enforcement to consult with, meet with local law enforcement to assess the circumstances, to strategize about what may or may not be necessary to provide federal assistance if it is necessary.
Presumably, you wrote the memo because of the letter. The letter is disavowed now. So you're going to keep your memo going anyway, right? Is that what you're telling me?
Senator, I have the letter from NSBA that you're referring to. It apologizes for language in the letter, but it continues its concern about the safety of school officials and school staff. The language in the letter that they disavow is language was never included in my memo and never would have been. I did not adopt every concern that they had in their letter. I adopted only the concern about violence and threats of violence, and that hasn't changed.
Who in the Justice Department was responsible for drafting your polarizing October 4th memo?
I signed the memo, and I worked on the memo.
The press release accompanying your memo mentions that the National Security Division will get involved in school board investigations. Is the Justice Department National Security Division really necessary for keeping local school boards safe if parents aren't domestic terrorists? And if the Patriot Act isn't being used, why is the National Security Division involved at all? This kind of looks like something that would come out of some communist country, expansive definition of national security.
The memo is only about violence and threats of violence. It makes absolutely clear in the first paragraph that spirited debate about policy matters is protected under our Constitution. That includes debate by parents criticizing school boards. That is welcome. The Justice Department protects that kind of debate. The only thing we're concerned about, Senator, is violence and threats of violence against school officials, school teachers, school staff. Just like we're concerned about those kind of threats against senators, members of Congress, election officials. In all of those circumstances, we are trying to prevent the violence that sometimes occurs after threats.
Your memo stated that the Justice Department is opening dedicated lines of communication for threat reporting, assessment, and response. What is the department doing with tips it receives on this dedicated line, and what are you doing with those parents who have been reported?
The FBI gets complaints, concerns from people around the country for all different kinds of threats and violence. That's what this is about, a place where people who feel that they've been threatened with violence can report that. These are then assessed, and they are only pursued if, consistent with the First Amendment, we have a true threat that violates federal statutes or that needs to be referred to a state or local government, federal agents, local law enforcement agency for their assistance.
On the other hand, Are there criminal investigations being opened for instances where school officials are trying to assess private data of parents with opposing views on critical race theory?
I don't know about that, but the Justice Department certainly does not believe that anybody's personal information should be accessed in that way. If there's a federal offense involved or a state or local offense involved, then of course those should be reported.
The nonpartisan Justice Department Inspector General established that Andrew McCabe lied under oath to FBI investigators. He lied under oath to the Justice Department Inspector General. It should also be noted that McCain leaked government information to the media and then called the New York and Washington FBI field offices and blamed them for the very leaks that he caused. Under your leadership, instead of punishing him, the department reinstated his retirement, expunged his records as part of the settlement. He will reportedly receive $200,000 in retirement back pay, and his attorney will reportedly receive $500,000 in legal fees. So it seems to me that that's beyond incredible. So General Garland, did you authorize the McCain settlement? And if not, who did?
Senator, the McCabe settlement was the recommendation of the career lawyers litigating that case based on their prospects of success in the case. The case did not involve the issues about lying. It involved a claim that he was not given amount of time necessary to respond to allegations. The litigators concluded that they needed to settle the case because of the likelihood of loss on the merits of that claim. The Inspector General's report still stands. We have not questioned in any way the Inspector General's findings. The reference with respect to false statements was made to the Justice Department in the previous administration and declined in the previous administration. The only issue here was an assessment of litigation merits.
Short follow-up. Do you agree with the taxpayer, since you didn't, somebody else authorized it, do you agree with the taxpayer picking up a multi-million-dollar bill for someone that lied under oath to government officials?
I think the assessment made by the litigators was that the bill to the taxpayers would be higher if we didn't resolve the matter as it was resolved.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Leahy.
Very much, Senator Cornyn. Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Attorney General. On September the 29th, 2021, as you know, the National School Board Association wrote a letter to the president asking him to address the disruptions, the confrontations that we've seen at local school boards across the country. Parents expressing their concerns about not only the curriculum, but also just generally the education of their children in public schools. Would you agree that parents have a fundamental right to be involved in their children's education?
Absolutely. This is the job of parents to be involved, and this is the role of the First Amendment to protect their ability to be involved. That's why my memo begins by saying that we respect the right to spirited debate about curriculum, about school policies, about anything like that.
So it's not just a good idea, it's actually protected by the Constitution of the United States. Would you agree?
Absolutely.
On October the 4th, a few days later, less than a week later, after the National School Board Association wrote this letter, the Justice Department issued the memo that's already been discussed. Why did this rise to the level of a federal concern as opposed to being addressed at the local and state level?
So this arises out of repeated reports of violence and threats of violence, not only with respect to school boards and school officials and teachers, but as I mentioned earlier, also with respect to secretaries of state and election administrators, judges, prosecutors, senators, members of Congress. The Justice Department has two roles here. We assist state and local law enforcement in all ways And we enforce federal laws which prohibit threats of violence by telephone, by email.
Well, you as a longtime federal judge with a distinguished legal career, you understand that not every crime, assuming it is a crime, is a federal crime, correct?
Absolutely.
And some of these things, unless there's some nexus to interstate commerce or to the federal government, they're largely within the purview of the state and local law enforcement authorities, correct?
I think you put that correctly. We have authority with respect to the mail, with respect to the internet, with respect
Right.
to
Well, I'm not,
telephone.
well, let me give you an example. If somebody says to the school board member, if you do that, I'm going to meet you outside and punch you in the nose, is that a federal offense?
No,
Or
that's not a federal offense.
I agree.
There's nothing
I agree.
in this memo
And-
suggesting that it is.
And why in the world would you cite the National Security Division in this memo as being one of the appropriate entities of the Department of Justice to investigate and perhaps prosecute these offenses?
So my memo itself doesn't mention the National Security Division. It is mentioned in another memo that was released by the department. The National Security Division, like all the other law enforcement components, cooperates with and is involved in discussions about how to go forward on different kinds of matters. They were involved, for example, in the election threats. They were involved in the threats against judges and prosecutors. They were involved in the hate crimes threats cases. It's just a natural part of our internal analysis.
Let me ask you, did you see the National School Board Association letter to President Biden before you issued your memorandum on October the 4th?
Yeah, yes, I did, and that was part of the reason, their expression at the beginning of that memorandum of
And they raised some of the concerns that you voiced here today, correct?
They raised some of them, they raised others that I don't agree with and were not included in my memo.
Well, you're aware that on October the 22nd, the National School Board Association apologized for its letter. You're aware of that, aren't you, sir?
I am, but
And it said that, went on to say, we regret and apologize for the letter. There was no justification for some of the language in the letter. They acknowledged that the voices of parents should be and must continue to be heard when it comes to decisions about their children's education, health, and safety. You did not apologize for your memorandum of October the 4th, even though the National School Board Association did. Why didn't you rescind that memorandum and apologize for the memorandum?
core responsibility of the Justice Department, as I said in my opening, is protecting Americans from violence and threats of violence.
But you just said not every act of violence is a federal crime, correct?
Right, and not every bit of street crime and the kind of violence that we've been talking about earlier today is also a federal crime, but we assist state and locals to help them in their investigations of these kind of matters. Every single day in non-federal matters, we are partners with our state and local partners.
Well, Mr. Attorney General, you've acknowledged that parents have a right, a constitutional right, to be heard on the education of their children in public schools. Can you imagine the sort of intimidation, the sort of bullying impact that a memorandum from the Department of Justice would have, and how that would chill the willingness of parents to exercise their rights under threat of federal prosecution? Did you consider the chilling impact your memorandum would have on parents exercising their constitutional rights?
The only thing this memorandum is about is violence and threats of violence, and it opens with a statement.
But my question is, did you consider the chilling effect this would have on parents' constitutional rights?
To say that the Justice Department is against violence and threats of violence.
Did you consider the chilling effect your memorandum might have on parents exercising their constitutional rights? I think you can answer that yes or no.
What I considered, what I wanted the memorandum to assure people that we recognize the rights of spirited debate And so
Mr. Attorney General, you're a very intelligent and accomplished lawyer and judge. You can answer the question.
I do
Did you
not-
consider
I do
the
not,
chilling effect that this sort of threat of federal prosecution would have on parents' exercise of their constitutional rights to be involved in their children's education?
don't believe it's reasonable to read this memorandum as chilling anyone's rights. It's about threats of violence, and it expressly recognizes the constitutional right to make arguments about your children's education.
As senators are going back and forth for votes during this time, we'll have to try to keep to
Let the record reflect the Attorney General refused to answer the question.
and let the record.
Mr. Attorney General, we had promised you a 5-minute break at 11:30. We can either take it right now, or I can have Senator Lee and Coons ask. Up to you.
I'm happy to go ahead with Senator Lee and Coons.
Let's proceed. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Attorney General Garland, for being here. Mr. Attorney General, I've been concerned in recent weeks by some steps that have been taken by the Biden administration, steps that I fear represent a significant amount of overreach. 7 weeks ago, you had President Biden giving a speech in which he promised to enlist the assistance of corporate America, all of corporate America, with more than 99 employees, in firing people who don't get vaccinated. Now, I'm vaccinated. I've encouraged everyone close to me to get vaccinated, but I don't think it's the role of the federal government to do that. He's threatening to cripple employers by imposing absolutely punishing fines on them, and they're now doing his dirty work, even before this act of overreach has been reduced to an order that could be litigated. Litigation that I believe would end the same way Youngstown Sheet and Tube versus Sawyer ended. And now, about a month after that, we had your October 4th memorandum in which you direct the Department of Justice and the FBI to intervene in what, as far as I can tell, is a state and local issue. That is a series of issues involving how parents advocate for their children with their local school boards. And I also believe that doing that through the Department of Justice, doing it in the way that you did it, directing the assistance, enlisting the help of all 94 U.S. attorneys, therefore every satellite office of the Department of Justice nationwide, you do it in a way that I think has a natural tendency to chill free speech in this area. I question seriously the role of the federal government in protecting people at local school board meetings from their neighbors. It is, after all, most of the time, state law, not federal, that's at play when there is criminal activity. Federal crimes are a subset of crimes generally. So you've referenced several times today that your letter covered only violence and threats of violence, and yet the very opening line of your memo says, in recent months, there's been a disturbing spike in harassment, intimidation, and threats of violence against school administrators, school board members, teachers, and staff who participate in the vital work of running our nation's public schools. You refer to this over and over again, and it's a pretty broad statement. I believe this has a tendency to chill free speech that is exercised at the state and local level, typically by neighbors, by parents to local school boards. In hindsight, would you agree that a natural consequence of your memo could be chilling free speech, protected speech by parents protesting local school board policies?
Senator, the memo is aimed only at violence and threats of violence. It states on its face that vigorous debate is protected. That is what this is about, and that is all this is about.
What about harassment and intimidation? Are those federal crimes?
They are federal crimes.
What, are you referring to like witness tampering intimidation under 18 U.S.C. 1512, or what?
To 18 U.S.C. 2261A, which makes it a crime with intent to injure, harass, or intimidate, placing a person in reasonable fear of serious bodily injury through communications over the internet. Likewise, 47 U.S.C. 223A, making telephones calls with intention to harass. Now, I want to be clear, though, that those only are within, I take your point, those are only within what is permitted by the First Amendment. And the Supreme Court has been clear about that, too. In the Virginia versus Black case, the court explained when intimidation is not protected by the Constitution, and that is when it is made with the intent of placing the victim in fear of bodily harm or death. So that's what we're concerned about here.
Well, and one of the things that concerns me is, we've got 17 attorneys general, led by Attorney General Todd Rokita in Nevada, and joined by a total of 17 attorneys general, including Sean Reyes, the fantastic attorney general of the state of Utah. And they've weighed in and they've said there is not a barrage of accusations. There's no unusual flood of accusations of threats of violence against school board members. Nothing unusual, nothing that they can't handle at the state and local level. Normally, things like this against state and local officials involving state and local government entities like school boards are not federal. Now, in response to a series of questions before the House Judiciary Committee, including some questions asked by Congressman Jim Jordan from Ohio, you were asked your factual predicate for your October 4th memorandum and for your conclusions in this regard. You answered before that committee that your factual predicate for that was the October 22nd memorandum from the National School Board Association. The National School Board Association has been mentioned, has since withdrawn that memo, and yet you said that was the factual predicate. Given that that was the factual predicate and that it's rescinded its memo saying that there was no justification for some of the language that they used in that letter, will you rescind your memo?
Senator, best of my recollection, I said that the impetus for the letter, for my memorandum, was that letter and also reports of this kind of activity.
What reports?
I said again that at the time that they were news reports that had been published, and I think that some of the other senators here have described some of those news reports, and we've certainly seen subsequently more news reports and more statements by board members of threats to kill them.
Congressman Chip Roy of Texas raised in that same hearing the issue of a 14-year-old girl in a school bathroom being sexually assaulted in Loudoun County. And you indicated in response to that that you weren't aware of that. And in the 6 days before you testified before the House Judiciary Committee, have you become familiar with the publicly reported details of that case?
Yes, I have read about the case, yes.
If you were unfamiliar with the supposed instances of threats of violence and intimidation that the National School Board Association cited in the letter, then how did you determine that intervention by the FBI and the DOJ was necessary, that was the right approach?
So the right approach in the letter is to meet with local law enforcement. That's what we've asked for, is to meet, to assess the situation, to see what their needs are, to strategize, and to open lines of communication. Now, I'm hopeful that many areas of local law enforcement will be well able to handle this on their own. But this is what the Justice Department does every day. We consult with our local and state partners and see whether assistance is necessary. And of course, we continue to have our own federal responsibilities with respect to communications by the internet, on social media, on telephone, through the mail. But I'm hopeful that we will not be needed in this area, that our state and local partners will be able to handle these threats.
My time's expired. I just want to state for the record as I close that my staff and I went through every news source raised by the National School Board Association. There was no explicit death threat. And I choose here to reiterate my concern that not every outburst or expression of concern by neighbors, among neighbors at a local school board meeting warrants a federal investigation. Certainly doesn't warrant the involvement of 94 U.S. attorneys in a way that threatens, intimidates, and tends inevitably to chill First Amendment activity. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Good morning, General.
Morning, Senator.
There's a lot that I couldn't get to.
General, I'm looking at this letter
Are almost certainly going to ask first.
from one of your
If you want it,
U.S. attorneys
questions or come back and ask questions.
from October of this year,
The office, but it's your
where he wrote to the
Think.
Montana Attorney General, all the county attorneys, and all the sheriffs in his jurisdiction, suggesting ways that parents could be prosecuted at school board for appearing at school board meetings in accordance with your directive. And one of the suggestions made by your U.S. attorney is parents can be prosecuted for repeated telephone calls. Not threatening anyone, just on the theory that repeated telephone calls could be harassment. Really?
Senator, I haven't seen that memorandum. I've tried to express as clearly as I can here.
I heard you, General, but this is one of your U.S. attorneys.
Senator, if you're thinking of
Again, I haven't seen,
Isn't that special?
technically chairing the hearing where Senator Durbin goes to vote, he didn't vote in the second vote.
Who needs to go?
General, you're just a vessel.
Sure.
Well, let me tell you what I'm talking about. With respect to the National School Boards Association letter, you're just a vessel, aren't you?
I'm not sure what you mean by that, but I signed this memorandum. I worked on this memorandum, and this memorandum is my memorandum.
Well, let me
not
tell
the
you what I
memorandum
mean.
of
We
National
know
School Board.
that the National School Board Association was upset because parents were coming to school board meetings to object to the teaching of critical race theory. We know that in drafting the letter, the National School Board Association collaborated with the White House for several weeks. They worked on it together. And we know that the National School Board Association, once the White House and the association were happy with the letter, the National School Board Association sent the letter to the White House, and the White House promptly called you and said, sic the FBI on parents at school board hearings. And that's what I mean. The White House is the prophet here. You're just the vessel. Isn't that correct?
Senator, I did not speak with anyone from the White House while I worked on this memorandum. This memorandum reflects my views that we need to protect public officials from violence and threats of violence, while at the same time protecting parents' ability to object to
Right.
policies.
I get that.
that they
I've heard
disagree
your
with.
testimony. Were you worried that you would be fired if you didn't issue the memorandum?
Senator, I'm not, I decided on this memorandum on my own. I don't care. I said from the very beginning, I've taken this job to protect the Department of Justice, to make independent determinations with respect to prosecutions and investigations, and I will do that.
Okay.
I'm not concerned about
Sorry to
being
interrupt,
fired.
General, but I don't have much time. Now, when you got the letter that from the White House that prompted your memorandum to give the FBI new duties in making sure our parents aren't dangerous domestic terrorists, you didn't investigate before you issued your memorandum the incidences cited in the letter, did you?
Look, I took a statement by the National Association, which represents thousands of school board members, when they said that they were facing violence and threats of violence, and when I saw in the news media reports.
Yeah, but you didn't investigate the incidents in the letter, did you?
No, this is the first step. This is an assessment step. It comes before investigations. The purpose
Right.
of this
Before you issued your memo, you didn't investigate the incidents.
the memo is intended to begin assessments. It is intended to
And in
ask-
fact, most of the incidents in the letter did not involve threats of violence, did they?
I think that's correct. Most of them did not,
Yeah.
and they would not be covered by either federal or state law. I agree with that, and they would be protected by the First Amendment. But threats of violence are not covered by the.
Can we agree that we have thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of kids growing up today who are more likely to commit a crime and go to jail than own a home or get married?
I don't know about the comparative statistics. I do know there are too many people who are committing crime.
And one of the reasons for that is lack of parental involvement, isn't it?
I think parental involvement is essential. I think it's the key both to bringing up good kids.
So why do you want to issue a memorandum listing incidents that you didn't investigate, that anybody who has any fair-minded knowledge of the world knows is going to have a chilling effect on parental involvement with respect to what their kids are learning at school?
I just want to be clear again, Senator. My memorandum did not list any of those incidents.
Come on, General, we both know this had a chilling effect. You don't think there are parents out there in the real world that said, oh my God, maybe we shouldn't go to the school board meeting, there'll be FBI agents there? We live in this isn't La La Land.
I tried to make clear as I could, and now I have subsequently made clear in every public statement on the matter.
Your actions made it clear, General. Let me ask you one last question. When men follow a United States senator who happens to be a female into a women's room to harass her about her beliefs, why is that just part of the process, as President Biden says? But when a parent goes to a school board meeting to protest that her child is being taught that babies can be white supremacists, is subject to FBI prosecution?
The description that you just gave, that parent is not subject to FBI investigation, and there's nothing in this memorandum that suggests this. We protect United States senators against threats of violence.
You did a good job with Senator Sinema.
Within the last month, we have indicted somebody who made threats of violence against both Alaska U.S. senators. Recently, we just indicted somebody else who made threats.
Can I ask one more, Mr. Chairman?
Can you wrap up, please, Senator Kennedy?
I'm sorry?
Could you wrap up? I am chairing this.
Oh, yes, ma'am. I will. I'm just going to ask one last one. What led you to conclude before you issued your memorandum sicking the FBI on parents that law enforcement at the state and local level couldn't handle it?
Let me be clear, Senator. We did not sic the FBI on parents. That's not what this memorandum is about. Nor did we conclude that local law enforcement is unable to deal with the problem. The purpose of this memorandum is for our federal law enforcement to engage with state and local and determine whether they need assistance.
And you don't think this had any chilling effect whatsoever on parents out there?
The memorandum expressly says at the beginning that it is aimed at violence and threats of violence, and expressly says that robust public debate about school policies are protected.
Right. Well, I like you, General, a lot, but
Thank you.
on this issue, you've turned into
Senator
someone
Kennedy.
you said you wouldn't be.
I recognize Senator Booker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For 8 years under Barack Obama, the Department of Justice was politicized and weaponized. When you came before this committee in your confirmation hearing, you promised things would be different. I asked you specifically, quote, will you commit to this committee that under your leadership, the Department of Justice will not target the political opponents of this administration? Here was your answer, quote, absolutely. It's totally inappropriate for the department to target any individual because of their politics or their position in a campaign. That was your promise just a few months ago. I'm sorry to say you have broken that promise. There is a difference between law and politics. And General Garland, you know the difference between law and politics. Law is based on facts. It is impartial. It is not used as a tool of political retribution. This memo was not law. This memo was politics. On Wednesday, September 29th, the National School Board Association wrote a letter to the president asking the president to use the Department of Justice to target parents that were upset at critical race theory, that were upset at mask mandates in schools, to target them as domestic terrorists. On the face of the letter was in repeated consultation with the White House, in explicit political consultation with the White House. That was on Wednesday, September 29th. 5 days later, on Monday, so right after the weekend, boom, you pop out a memo, giving them exactly what they want. Now, by the way, I understand that. In politics, that happens all the time. An important special interest wants something. Sir, yes, sir. We're going to listen to him. Let me ask you something, General Garland. In the letter, which you told the House of Representatives was the basis for this abusive memo targeting parents, how many incidents are cited in that memo?
I have to look back through the memo. I can't count it.
You don't know. How many of them were violent?
Again, the general report.
How many of them were violent? Do you know?
I don't know.
You don't know. And there's a reason you don't know. Because you didn't care, and nobody in your office cared to find out. I did a quick count just sitting here. During this hearing, I counted 20 incidents cited. Of the 20, 15 on their face are nonviolent. They involve things like insults. They involve a Nazi salute. That's one of the examples. My God, a parent did a Nazi salute at a school board because he thought the policies were oppressive. General Garland is doing a Nazi salute at an elected official. Is that protected by the First Amendment?
Yes, it is.
Okay. 15 of the 20 on the face of it are not violent. They're not threats of violence. They're parents who are unhappy. Yet, miraculously, when you write a memo, the opening line of your memo, in recent months, there has been a disturbing spike in harassment, intimidation, and threats of violence. You know what? You didn't look, and nobody on your staff looked. Did you even look up the 20 instances?
As I testified, the decision to send a memo is for an assessment.
Did you look up the 20 instances?
I did not read.
Did anyone on your staff look them up?
I don't know the answer, but it's not
But of
the
course
memo.
you don't. In general, there's a reason. Look, you started your career as a law clerk to Justice Brennan. You've had many law clerks during the year, during your time as a judge. I was a clerk to Chief Justice Rehnquist. I'll tell you what, if I drafted an opinion for the Chief Justice and walked in and it said, there's a disturbing pattern of violence, well, Ted, how do you know that? Well, I got an amicus brief here who claims it. You would fire a law clerk who did that. You're the Attorney General of the United States. This was not a tweet you sent. This is a memo to the Federal Bureau of Investigations saying, go investigate parents as domestic terrorists.
That is not what the memo says at all. It does not.
Is it what the letter says?
That is not what.
Is it what the letter says?
I don't care what the letter says.
You don't care. You said it was the basis of your memo. You testified under oath before the House of Representatives. The letter was the basis of your memo. Now you don't care about the letter?
The letter and public reports of violence and threats of violence. My memo says nothing about domestic terrorism, says nothing about parents committing any such things. My memo is an attempt to get an assessment of whether there is a problem out there that the federal government needs to resolve.
The letter on its face says the actions of the parents could be the equivalent to a form of domestic terrorism.
And that is wrong.
And asks the president to use the Patriot Act in regards to domestic terrorism
And
directed at parents.
And
This was the basis of your memo.
My memo.
The Department of Justice, when you're directing the FBI to engage in law enforcement, you're not behaving as a political operative because a political ally of the president says, hey, go attack these parents because we don't like what they're saying. Department of Justice, you did no independent research on what was happening, did you?
The memo has nothing to do with partisan.
Did you do independent research?
The memo has.
Did you do independent research?
The memo has nothing to do.
Okay, you're
with
not
partisan
answering that
politics.
You've testified you know nothing about the violent sexual assault that happened in Loudoun County, even though it's one of the bases in this letter.
I read about it since then.
Okay. You told the House last week you knew nothing about it.
Not know at the time, no.
Okay. This week, the court concluded that a 14-year-old girl was violently raped by a boy wearing a skirt in the girls' restroom. The school district covered it up, released the boy, sent him to another school where he violently raped another girl. The father, who Mr. Hawley just showed you, was the father of the first girl. He was understandably, do you understand why a parent would be upset when your daughter is raped at school, the school board covers it up, and then lies to you and claims there have been no assaults, we have no instances of assaults in our bathroom, and that was a flat-out lie, as the court concluded this week. Do you understand why the parent would be upset?
Absolutely, and any expressions of upset are completely protected by the First Amendment.
Except you just called him a domestic
I
terrorist.
never called him that. That's not correct.
This letter calls him a domestic terrorist. You based a direction to the FBI, an official direction from the Attorney General, on this letter, and I'll tell you what, the NSBA is so embarrassed of this letter, they've apologized for it and retracted it, but you don't apparently have the same willingness to apologize and retract what you did.
Judge, I want to return to our exchange this morning. As I've reflected on it, you made a shocking admission. You issued this memo sicking the feds on parents at school boards on Monday, October 4th. You acknowledged that there was no effort in the Department of Justice, no initiative to draft this memo or create these task forces before Wednesday, September 29th, when the National School Board Association issued that letter. Is that correct?
I don't know. All I know is that the first time I started working on this was after receiving the letter. That's all I.
So from your standpoint, you were not aware of any effort in the Department of Justice before that letter was sent on September 29th.
I think it's fair to say, as you're suggesting, that this letter and what the other public notices of violence against school board members and teachers are what form the basis for this memorandum. Yes.
This memo is dated October 4th with your signature on it. Did you sign it on October 4th?
I did.
So 4 intervening days, 2 of which were weekend days.
Yes.
I'd say that sets a land speed record for the federal government.
When we
Chuck Grassley pointed out that you have not responded to letters of his that have been outstanding for months. How is it the Department of Justice was able to move so rapidly on a single letter from a special interest group that has now repudiated that letter, said it regrets sending the letter, and apologized to its members for sending the letter? How did your department move so fast on this matter?
When an organization that represents thousands of school board members,
I would say they purport to represent thousands because state school boards across the country have been repudiating them and trying to withdraw their membership. That's why the National School Board Association withdrew its own letter. Who brought this to your attention?
May I answer the question?
I'm asking you a question now. Who brought this to your attention?
You asked me a question. May I answer the question? The question is, why speed? The answer is, when we get reports of violence and threats of violence, we need to act very swiftly. I would have hated it to have gotten this letter and then acts of violence occurred in the interim before we were able to act.
Okay,
the
Judge.
only act here is assessing the circumstances. That's all there is here, and we can't wait until somebody dies. That's
Judge,
why we did this.
Okay, well, you keep citing media reports. There were 24 incidents in that letter. As you've heard today, almost all of them were nonviolent.
Those
they
are
weren't
not the
involved
media
threats of
reports
violence.
I was referring to.
You said earlier it was news reports. Okay, what other reports that you saw about potential violence at school boards were you basing this memo
I
on?
don't recall them specifically, but I have now again seen since that time people saying that they're repeating what they said before.
But that's all
they were
post-talk. It's
threatened
all after the fact. It doesn't matter. It doesn't go into your mind, your frame of mind on October 4th. Who brought this to you? Who brought this memo to you and asked you to sign it?
Nobody brought the memo to me and asked me to sign
Someone had to bring it to your attention. Hey, Judge, we're about to stick the feds on parents.
I'm sorry, no one said we're about to sick the feds.
Someone
on
brought
parents.
this.
That's not an accurate description.
Was this an initiative of Lisa Monaco?
This memorandum went through the normal processes within the department, and I worked on it myself. And
Someone
then
is a
signed it.
proponent. Someone was a proponent. I bet you didn't write the first draft of this. Where did it come from?
I
Did
didn't
it come
write
from
the
Lisa
first
Monaco?
draft, but I did work on this memorandum, and it represents my views, and it represents my reading of the materials.
Did it come from Vanita Gupta's office?
I'm not going to discuss.
Was this Matt Clapper's initiative?
I'm not going to discuss the internal workings of the Justice Department here. This memorandum reflects my view, and I stand behind it, and I continue to stand behind it.
Are you aware of conversations between members of your Department of Justice and the White House leading up to that letter
I
from
am
the School Board
sure
Association?
there were no conversations with me. I'm sure there were conversations. It's perfectly appropriate when the White House receives a letter calling for law enforcement response across the board, not with respect to a specific case, for the White House to have conversations with the Justice Department.
Are you aware of conversations between your Department of Justice officials and White House officials and the members of the School Board Association all cooperating together, which is why you were able to move in 4 days, Judge? 4 days, 2 of which were weekends.
As I said, I am sure there were conversations with the White House. I have no idea whether there were conversations with the School Board Association.
Well, I bet we're going to find out if there were, and if it doesn't happen now, it'll happen in 15 months when Republicans are in charge.
Well, there's nothing wrong with there being such conversations. Let me be clear again. This is not a request to investigate any particular person or prosecute any particular person. In the same way you ask me to worry about violence in the streets, it's perfectly appropriate for the White House to urge me to worry about violence in the streets. Same way, they're perfectly appropriate for the White House or any other organization to urge me to worry about election threats. There's nothing that I knew about this organization to suggest that it is in any way partisan. It's a National School Board Association. I certainly never, in my mind, viewed that as a partisan organization.
And now that they've repudiated their letter, why won't you just say you made a mistake?
Because they didn't.
Why would you say you made a mistake and you relied on bad information?
Because they didn't repudiate their letter. They repudiated language in the letter which I did not adopt and don't agree with. But their concerns are about safety in the schools and about violence, and this is a core concern of the Justice Department. That's why.
Thank you. Senator Blackburn has asked for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Attorney General Garland, you just told me that you don't think you ever met Susan Hennessey. Did you hire Susan Hennessey?
I have sign-off authority for everybody, I suppose, in the Justice Department.
Okay.
That's the best I can answer with respect to that. But the question you were worried about, Senator, and I understand, had to do with Durham. And as I explained, she has nothing to do with the Durham investigation.
Okay, were you unaware of her comments before you hired her?
Again,
You don't know.
I hire 115,000 people in the Justice Department.
I'm fully aware of that. And it's amazing to us that those 115,000 people can't investigate things like crime on the border, can't investigate crime on the streets. And, you know, I'm going to return to this memo of October 4th. The memorandum cites harassment, intimidation, and threats of violence. And what I'd like to know is who chose that language, harassment, intimidation, and threats of violence. You've said this reflected your views, but it's become apparent that you did not write this memo yourself. So I would like to know who came up with that language. Was that yours or was that submitted language?
So I don't know whether, let me put it this way. This is language that law enforcement officers are very well understand. It is contained in the federal statute.
Okay, well, in the House Judiciary
Opinion.
Committee last week, you said you were concerned only about true threats.
Yeah.
So are you going to revise your memorandum to make it clear that this applies only to true threats of violence, instead of classifying parents in this country with domestic terrorists such as Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols? The other thing I would like to know, you said to me earlier that your memo was based on the NSBA letter and the news reports. So you've said there was not a lot of independent research done by you and your staff. So if you would please submit to us for the record the news reports that you're referencing so that we will be able to have that as a frame of reference. And also, we would love to know who actually did write that memo and how they came up with the idea of calling parents a domestic terrorist. One other thing I've got for you. Do you agree with the Supreme Court that the Second Amendment is a civil right? And if so, what is your Civil Rights Division doing to ensure it is being protected?
So just to back up on some of the questions, the memo doesn't say anything about domestic terrorism or calling parents domestic terrorists. I do agree the Second Amendment is part of the Bill of Rights and is therefore a civil right. The Civil Rights Division has some generalized authorities, but it also has specific statutory authorities. I don't know whether there is a specific statutory authority with respect to the Second Amendment that has been given by Congress to the Civil Rights Division. I'm not aware of one. There may be, but I'm not aware of it.
Okay, so we can depend on you and your Department of Justice to stand in support of the Second Amendment. Is that what you're saying, to defend it?
Yes, of course.
Okay,
The Second Amendment
thank
is
you.
part of the Bill of Rights.
It's what we would like to know, and I'll look forward to the other submissions in writing. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You've cited as the basis for that directive the National School Board Association's letter of September 29th. Was that directive being prepared before September 29th, before the School Board Association letter was issued?
I don't believe so. Certainly, I didn't have any idea.
So it was only prepared at, okay, I think that answers the
I
question.
already answered that
So
question
you
before.
keep citing the school board letter and news reports.
right.
One of the news reports cited in that letter, which you presumably mean, is from Loudoun County, Virginia.
No, that's
Scott-
not. That is not what I was talking about. I was
Well,
talking about-
you keep citing news reports, and that's the most prominent news report that anyone in America has seen. That refers to Scott Smith, whose 15-year-old daughter was raped. She was raped in a bathroom by a boy wearing girls' clothes, and the Loudoun County School Board covered it up because it would have interfered with their transgendered policy during Pride Month. And that man, Scott Smith, because he went to a school board and tried to defend his daughter's rights, was condemned internationally. Do you apologize to Scott Smith and his 15-year-old daughter, Judge?
Senator, anyone whose child was raped is the most horrific crime I can imagine, and is certainly entitled and protected by the First Amendment to protest to their school board about this.
But he was cited by the School Board Association
That's fine,
as a
but that's
domestic
not-
terrorist, which we now know that letter and those reports were the basis for your.
No,
this
no,
is
Senator,
this is
that's wrong.
shameful, Judge.
That's-
This is shameful.
that's-
This testimony, your directive, your performance is shameful.
Okay, that's not.
Thank God you are not on the Supreme Court. You
That-
should resign in disgrace, Judge.
General Garland, do you want to complete your answer on?
Okay, I wasn't sure there was a question there, but let me be clear. The news reports I'm talking about were not the news reports in that letter. They were other news reports that everybody here has heard about, subsequent reports that everybody has heard about. There is nothing in this memorandum, and I wish if senators were concerned about this, they would quote my words. This memorandum is not about parents being able to object in their school boards. They are protected by the First Amendment. As long as there are no threats of violence, they are completely protected. So parents can object to their school boards about curriculum, about the treatment of their children, about school policies. All of that is 100% protected by the First Amendment, and there is nothing in this memorandum contrary to that. We are only trying to prevent violence against school officials. Thank you.
Senator Hirono?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to